Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure we're just notified on your screens, this webinar is being recorded, and I will share more on that in just a moment. I'm going to wait a few more seconds to allow a few more folks to join us, but thank you for being here and stay tuned. Alrighty. Well, it looks like we already have a strong number of folks with us this afternoon, and we're afternoon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for being here. The Virginia chapter is always happy to help host the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration webinar series. And this month we have a lovely team from Pennsylvania with us to discuss affordable housing, urban, suburban, and rural perspectives. I'll be handing it over to Leah Eppinger, the Pennsylvania chapter president, in just a moment. But I wanted to provide some basic information, including the CM number, um, for you to log your credits for this webinar. Also, just some quick housekeeping items and logistical items. We really do encourage questions, and we'll have plenty of time to get to questions this afternoon, but please submit your questions through the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. That will just help us keep track of all inquiries. We'll leave the chat box open if there's ever an opportunity for open-ended discussion, or if you have any logistical questions, feel free to DM me. You can also use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted during the formal Q&A if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud. And if that's the case, we would ask that you show your video as well. I am just running through. Oh, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared to the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration webinar or YouTube page, excuse me, and I will share the link to that in the chat box momentarily. I'll also share a couple of links to the MAPC website page in the chat as well, so keep your eyes peeled there. And I think that about wraps up the logistical items. So I'm going to hand it over to Leah to further introduce our speakers. But thank you, everybody, for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks, Jillian. And thank you all for being here today. My name is Leah Eppinger, and I'm the president of the Pennsylvania chapter of the APA. And as my day job, I'm the executive director of the Dauphin County Housing Authority, and our affiliate nonprofit where we do development of affordable housing. So housing topics are always very close to my heart, and I'm happy to be here moderating this discussion. So housing obviously is a universal issue, but the challenges and opportunities can look really different depending on where we are geographically, in a city, a suburb, or in a rural community. The Pennsylvania landscape can vary from town to town and city to city, providing a great cross-section of communities, which allows it to demonstrate a wide range of both affordable housing successes and barriers. Today, we want to bring all of those perspectives to the table, so no matter where you live or work, the conversation feels relevant and applicable to you. So we'll explore some key barriers that each geography faces, highlight some innovative approaches, and look to what the future of affordable housing might hold across Pennsylvania and potentially across the Mid-Atlantic. Most importantly, we want to uncover ways that lessons learned in one setting can also be applied to others. So as you see on your screen, we have three really great panelists today. Emily Dowdle, who is the president of Policy Solutions at the Reinvestment Fund, Ed Leclerc, who is the Planning and Community Development Director at the Borough of State College. He is also our legislative chair at the chapter. And Silas Chamberlain, who is the Chief Strategy Officer and VP of Economic and Community Development in the County of York. So we're so honored to have you all here, and we thank you for sharing your expertise and your understanding of affordable housing in your specific geography. So with that, and to not drone on as an introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Emily Dowdle to kick this off with our urban perspective.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. So I'm Emily Dowdle, as Leah said, and first I just want to thank the PA chapter of APA and the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaborative for having us here today. It's really exciting to be able to share some of our work with all of you on these really important issues. And I will briefly talk about reinvestment funds. So we are a community development financial institution certified by the U.S. Department of the Treasury. We are based in Philadelphia, but we work nationally. And in addition to the lending work that CDFIs typically do, we also have a data and analytics team, which I lead. And we work with a lot of external clients, again, across the country. Helping them use data to inform strategic use of dollars and programming and policy change. Reinvestment Fund also has a capacity building capital access programs team that does a lot of technical assistance and grant work that all together offer a set of comprehensive tools to support communities and their needs. So I'm going to start out with some larger context because I always love a lot of context. So I'm just going to take a quick, we're going to start with the national picture quickly. I know that sort of international supply chains are on everyone's mind when it comes to the cost of new housing. So just to put that a little bit in historical perspective from the last 25 years, so these are the trends on housing starts from the census, and you can see that, these are all, each line is a state here. And you can see that while there's variation from state to state, everywhere across the board saw this huge drop in permitting activity right after the foreclosure crisis. So that really slowed things down production-wise. Then things started to climb again in most places until the pandemic, and then until 2021 when interest rates spiked and going into 2022. And you see that little drop off almost everywhere except in California where there was a little hitch up. When we come down to just a few states from the Mid-Atlantic, sorry for Maryland and Virginia folks for leaving you off this chart, but just to give you an idea, you still see that same trend of the fall off since the foreclosure crisis. Delaware, smaller state, smaller volume. And interestingly, though, there's this spike you see in Pennsylvania in 2021, which is actually driven entirely, pretty much entirely by Philadelphia, and has another explanation that sort of, to me, really exemplifies how important it is to have a local market understanding of what's happening in the housing world. And so this is just those residential authorized starts specifically for Philadelphia. And you see that big jump in 2021 and then the drop. And that was actually caused by a policy change in Philadelphia. It was the end of the 10-year by right tax abatement for residential development, which exempted the value of improvement from taxation for 10 years on all new residential property. And so a policy change was made that essentially cut the value of that tax abatement in half. But so long as a developer applied for the permit before December 31st, 2021, they could get the full value of the abatement whenever that project was built. So developers just went ahead and filed permits on everything. The per permit number of units went up from below 4 per unit, units per permit to over 10, as developers just threw a whole lot of multifamily proposals in there and permitted whatever they could, knowing that not everything would get built, but they wanted the abatement in case they could. And so you see it come down. And so, there really is a bit of a drop from 2020 to 2022, but not so extreme as this graph might have first present. But now, after providing just a little snapshot on the national stage, I do want to get down to our work looking at a much finer geography, because we know that housing markets really operate on a much smaller scale. And so we've been working with Moody's and with PolicyMap to develop a tool to understand exactly what the housing needs are, the housing gaps are at the tract level across the country. We started with Philadelphia, and then we actually have expanded this to look at all cities of at least 100,000. And that's actually available on PolicyMap for free. PolicyMap is an affiliated company of Reinvestment Fund. Many of you are probably familiar with them. Some of you may even use their tool for work. But if you go to policymap.com, you'll be able to find this tool also and explore other cities. But this is what it looks like when we compare historic vacancy rates to current vacancy rates and see what the difference is. So a healthy, functioning real estate market is going to have a degree of vacancy, but not really high and not really low. And so we looked at vacancy rates today compared to vacancy rates before the pandemic period over 5 years that were what we call normal, although of course there's not really a normal when it comes to housing. And what we found is, there's pretty uneven, that housing gaps are not evenly distributed across the country. And so what we see here is in these purple areas, you can see that there is a gap. There are gaps. The negative numbers here show gaps in number of units compared to what need would indicate. And so we see that in Northeast Philadelphia, Northwest Philadelphia, North Philly, there's all undersupply of housing. But you see those brown areas right where the highways come together in Center City, Philadelphia, so near that 95 sign. And you can see that there's actually oversupply, and that's really where a lot of the new housing has been getting built over the last decade or so. And it turns out that's not actually where all the demand is. And then we also separated this out by supply for owners and renters. And so we found that across all the undersupplied areas in Philadelphia, the total owner shortfall is about 6,000 units. And again, we sort of see those areas in the Northeast and the Northwest pop up. And you can see that areas that are a little bit into Southwest Philly, a little bit into North Philly, are actually oversupplied when it comes to ownership housing. When we look at renters, we see something similar, but a little bit distinct. And one thing that's interesting to me about this renters map is this is where you really see that Center City, Philadelphia is oversupplied. You see those little dark brown pockets sort of pop up. And again, this is sort of also proved out if you just have read the news recently in Philadelphia, where there's all of these luxury apartment buildings that are now offering deals to move in, all kinds of incentives, because in fact, that type of housing in that spot has been overbuilt. Whereas there is a need for more rental housing up in the far Northeast, where, a local council person is not necessarily supportive of more rental housing. And so then taking a look at the county level and a few other places across the region. So you see Newcastle County, Delaware, which was the home of Wilmington, Camden County, New Jersey, Delaware County, PA, which is just outside of Philly, for those of you not from Pennsylvania, and Lehigh County, PA, which is up in the Lehigh Valley and includes Allentown. And, what I think is notable about this chart is that 3 of the 4 places have greater gaps for renters than they do for owners. So you take a look at Newcastle, and so there's an estimated gap of about 3,000 units for renters and about 1,300 units needed for owners. So that is the biggest gap that we see across there, whereas in Delaware County, Lehigh County, they're a little bit closer. And then in Camden County, there's actually a need for more ownership housing. Then I want to talk about the limits of the current affordability framework and how that creates challenges, especially for cities. So I'm not sure what the background of everyone on this call, but you've probably heard the term area median income, and that is used for federal funds that are that are supporting subsidized housing. And so in Philadelphia, the area includes 11 counties across 4 states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, as you see here on the map. And the incomes, when we look at them at the county level, vary a lot. So the income, median income in Chester County is actually more than double the median income in Philadelphia County. And these numbers are a couple years old, actually, so we would assume that today these numbers are bigger, but the relationship has been pretty consistent over time, with Chester County sort of outpacing Philadelphia twofold. And so we see the median income here falling in at $114,000, which is, still almost twice that of Philadelphia County. And when we take a look at this, so what this chart does is it compares the income at different thresholds for the city of Philadelphia compared to the AMI set by HUD. So just to explain that, so for example, here, if you look at the 100% columns, in the year we did this chart, the HUD AMI was 96,000. The Philadelphia median income for the city was 58,000. And so you can see that Philadelphia's median income actually equals about 60% of the median income for the region. And what that means is half of Philadelphia households can't afford a unit that's priced at 80% of AMI. They're going to need something that's priced at 60% of AMI or less. And so when we put together the income levels at the tract level with that supply data that I was showing you and our gap estimates, we find that the biggest gaps in Philadelphia for housing are located in areas that are earning less than 80% of AMI. And so this chart, just to orient you to this chart, I know it has a lot. So this is organized by the AMI band. So 0 to 30% of AMI on up to 120% of AMI, the highest income bracket, and what that actually means in terms of incomes. And then how we compared this and got the need for new ownership units. So this is sort of the breakdown, if you look at the need for new units columns of ownership and rental, of the share of total demand for new units and how it's distributed. So you can see that, for example, 10% of the demand is for ownership units priced at 30 to 50% of AMI, priced for people making 30 to 50% of AMI. And so then you can also see overall that 65% of the gap is for rental units and 35% is for homeowners. But a lot of that is concentrated, you only see 1% of need in the category of over 120%. And probably something like 95% of the new supply is for that income level. So there's just a big mismatch. There's also a real need for preservation in the city of Philadelphia and in, most of the cities and the urban centers that are going to be in our region. So you can see that nearly 100, close to about 90% of the need for preservation is actually for people earning less than 50% of AMI. So this very strong concentration of need in the lower income brackets. This is a snapshot from our analysis of the Allentown housing market. And what we did here was we found that it's really helpful for people outside of the housing world to think about, in order to understand affordability, talk about occupations. And this is something that we've actually tried when we were in Richmond, Virginia as well. And it's something that just really resonates with people. Once you move away from saying this person is at this AMI band, which, doesn't really mean a whole lot to a lot of people, and say, we're talking about a home health aide, we're talking about someone working at McDonald's, we're talking about someone who's a cashier, people that you interact with often throughout your day. Many of these are public-facing jobs. And how much can they actually afford to pay based on that salary? And so we can see that the typical one-bedroom rent in Allentown is $1,250 per month. And then you can see what all of these occupations can actually afford to pay, which is no more than about $1,000 and sometimes much less. And so you can see there's whole classes of workers who are going to really struggle to pay for housing. And what that means in Allentown is that 54% of the demand is for apartments that cost less than $1,000 based on people's occupations. And the supply of apartments in Allentown that cost $1,000 or less is only 4%. So there's an incredible mismatch between the price of housing and the incomes of people who live in central cities. All right, and now I'm going to talk about market valuation. So we have a tool that we developed at Reinvestment Fund called the Market Value Analysis. It helps stakeholders really understand their real estate markets. It uses administrative data like building permits, foreclosures, code violations, and sales to really understand what differentiates real estate submarkets. And then we use that to help match tools to where they're going to be most effective. So just a snapshot of some of the places we've worked. Philadelphia, we're about to start our 9th market value analysis. We like to update these about every 3 years. We've done the state of Delaware twice and are looking to return. Baltimore, we've done almost as many times as Philadelphia, I believe 6 times. We just wrapped that up last year. We just finished up last year our first MVA for Allentown, which was really a great pleasure getting to know Allentown better. And we've also worked in Camden, as well as a number of other cities across the Mid-Atlantic and across the country. So this is an example of the Philadelphia MVA where you can see there's 10 different categories, and the prices range from about $780,000 in the most expensive category down to about $44,000 in the lowest cost category. But price is not the only differentiator of markets. So for example, we see that permitting is actually pretty widespread across a lot of Philadelphia markets, though it's a little bit higher in Bs, whereas we see a little bit of elevated new construction. The new construction is a lot more concentrated and really shows up in these D markets on those bright blue. We also find that vacancy and code violations are really, really concentrated in those more distressed and lower cost markets. And these are just some of there's about 5 other indicators that go into this model where we use a statistical clustering and method for separating out these markets. And those F markets, I'll just highlight, those have the largest number of block groups, which is that count there. So 262 block groups in the city fall into that. And those are really what we consider our classic middle neighborhoods in Philadelphia. So in Allentown, we only find 7 markets because it's a smaller city. And you see that the scale of the prices are a bit more compressed. So the highs in the highest cost market are $430,000, so lower than in Philadelphia. But also when you look at the lower end, the prices don't drop as low as they do in Philadelphia. So it's generally of a more compressed market than a city like Philadelphia. And I think one interesting thing about Allentown is that in some of their more distressed markets, the issue is really crowding. It's not vacancy. You don't see vacancy rise to the level of Philadelphia in any of their markets. But there's a lot of stress on the lowest cost markets because there's a lot of folks living there. It's the most affordable place in the Lehigh Valley to live. And so there's a lot of competition for the scarce resource of the more affordable units. And you can also see there's a lot of permitting in those F markets. These are neighborhoods that are adjacent to a lot of the investment that's gone into downtown Allentown. And so there's a lot of upward price pressure as well in these neighborhoods. So then I'm just going to talk briefly about some solutions that we've seen in a couple places, because we don't want to just identify problems. We want to lift up what can be done. And so our work in Allentown led to the Welcome Home housing plan that was announced in January. And you can see some of these components started with laying the groundwork through a revision to the zoning code, which is a form-based code now, as well as ongoing work to improve existing code enforcement. We also identified a need to increase housing funding, and they're exploring a housing trust fund to do that, as well as looking into more grant funds and looking to acquire land so that can be used as a subsidy in affordable housing development. Then they're starting to build out some initiatives around preserving affordability, rehabbing aging housing stock, increasing supply. And also, this was really important to the local stakeholders, was increasing homeownership for Allentown residents. And finally, Allentown doesn't exist in a vacuum. No city does. And Allentown, it was really important to them to identify that they want to connect with regional planning efforts because workforce issues and housing issues and infrastructure issues are all really regional. And Allentown wants to be able to work with neighboring communities in order to address these issues. And there's also a need, for continued advocacy at the state level and federal level. In Pennsylvania, we are now having more, we've had more housing resources than we have in the past, but there's always a need for more. And just thinking about how we help them lay out some programs to introduce along with which are that column on the left, and then how they meet the goals of the plan and the columns going across. And so thinking specifically about affordability, creating a land trust, a small landlord renovation program, a vacant home rehab program, homeowner repair programs, affordable housing construction through gap financing, and then first-time home buyer programs. And so just to get into a slight more detail about the landlord repair program, which these are sort of increasingly being tried out in a lot of places. It's a lot easier to start with a homeowner repair program because, of course, you're working directly with the owner who is also the occupant. So you can clearly see who's benefiting. Whereas other questions come up with landlords about whether you're benefiting the occupant versus the owner and how to make sure that you're achieving your affordable housing goals. So in this case, the program structure is trying to get to a $40,000 per unit cap with using local funds paired with CDBG dollars. It's for structures with less than 10 units. There's a range of uses from systems repairs to facade improvements to retrofitting for accessibility. And this is actually going to be structured as a low interest loan that can be forgivable. And so often it's been pretty rare to see forgivable loans for landlords. We see them for homeowners in a lot of markets. But the idea here is to try out doing this for landlords as well. And so this isn't a program that's off the ground yet, but this is something that they are hoping to get off the ground. And this would also be geographically targeted to those C through E markets we identified in our market value analysis. And the landlord would have to agree to rent at 80% of AMI or below. And there would be a rental inspection along with this, which is part of the code enforcement process. So then in Philadelphia, an example, so the city just adopted the Philadelphia Housing Opportunities Made Easy or Home Plan that we helped to shape. And it has goals to preserve homes, make homes more affordable, build more housing, make the city work better for people. So making it easier to actually access all of those programs, prevent housing instability, meet resiliency needs given storms and floodings, and reduce blight and generally improve communities. So that's a tall order, I know, but we have an ambitious mayor and we have an ambitious council. And so the city actually passed $800 million in bond funding that will be available over the next 4 years to implement the home plan. Which is unprecedented for the city. So we have a tremendous amount of resources available, and there are these 4 buckets of the initiative, which include just improving internal processes, including the use of technology, and partnering with other resources in order to fully fund the program. Introducing zoning and tax code reforms that will set up some of the new development. So revisiting what's going on with our tax abatement, which has, been subject to lots of debate over the years. And then starting with continuing investing in programs that are working and that people like. So we actually are just closing out a former bond issue that had paid for our very popular first-time homebuyer grant program, as well as other programs. And so those programs now have a new lease on life. They're going to be refunded, and they're going to be expanded in some cases. But there's also going to be a lot of new programs that are going to promote different types of access for homeowners, as well as stability for tenants and landlords. So it's thinking about a lot of different audiences, which I think is really important. You know, how do you serve homeowners? How do you serve renters, landlords, developers, and contractors? Because all of them are really important parts of the ecosystem. And so just one example of a new program that's getting designed is based on a really successful program in Massachusetts. And this is part of the mayor's push to make homeownership accessible to middle and lower income folks, because historically we did have a lot of low and moderate income homeownership in Philadelphia. It's never really recovered since the foreclosure crisis, and we now have a lot of competition from investor buyers. So in Massachusetts, this is a low down payment mortgage loan with discounted interest rates. The state has a loan loss reserve that it pays for that eliminates the need for mortgage insurance. And so the idea is in Philadelphia, we're going to use some of the bond proceeds to actually serve as a loan loss reserve. But there's also really important components of homebuyer education, both before and after purchase. And so in Massachusetts, this has been super successful over 25 years, getting 20,000 households to purchase homes. And about half of all those loans have gone to households of color, and about 2/3 of them are in urban neighborhoods that were historically underserved by conventional lending. And really worth noting is that the foreclosure rates for these loans are actually substantially lower than for prime loans. So Massachusetts has kind of proved this out, and we're going to try this at the city level. And that is all I've got for you today. So you're welcome to follow up and email me with questions or requests for data after this presentation. Thank you.
Great, Emily. Thank you so much for sharing all of that great data with us. I know that's always a challenge, is how do we capitalize on the information and how do we get that information into one succinct area so that we can move forward. So for the sake of time, I was going to ask some questions, but we're going to save them for the end, and we're going to move forward with the presentation that Silas is loading on currently and talk more about a more suburban county and a different sort of geographic typography here that faces similar housing challenges, but in a different way. So I will also provide everybody's contact information to the group before the event is over. We will add them all to the chat for you.
All right. Thank you, Leah, and thanks, Emily. I'm going to talk about our work in York County, Pennsylvania. And just to orient you a little bit, York County is located in South Central Pennsylvania. We have a population of about 450,000 residents, a city of 45,000 residents at our heart, and then a whole bunch of rural and suburban and small towns and boroughs spread across the 911 square miles. My organization is an umbrella organization that is home to an economic development corporation, a chamber of commerce, a Main Street and business improvement district. And then on behalf of our county commissioners, we staff our general authority, land bank authority, industrial development authority, redevelopment authority. And so we have a lot of different mechanisms for getting involved in a variety of economic issues in the community. Our involvement with housing really dates back only to about 2020. Prior to the pandemic, we, of course, were involved in housing in a peripheral way. But coming out of the pandemic, we completed a new 10-year economic action plan for York County. That's a chapter of our comp plan, and really wanted to focus it on issues that we believed would lead to tangible economic progress, revisiting how we did business as economic developers and our partnerships with our municipalities and others in the community, and really focused on economic opportunity and mobility. And the outcome of that was our 10-year economic action plan that is all-encompassing in terms of economic issues, everything from quality of place to investment in manufacturers and other high growth industries to workforce development. And everything in between. And we've been implementing that since 2020 in a variety of different ways across all kinds of programs, from trail towns to countywide broadband to creating a CDFI and making low interest loans to small businesses. And we track all that through a really ugly dashboard that we only keep internally, but it allows us to see where we've made progress, what we've initiated, and what we have not across 142 different actions within our 10-year plan. And a couple years ago, at the end of the year, we pulled back and looked at those 142 actions and saw that we had made a lot of progress. About 80% of the EAP's overall actions were either complete or underway. But there was a whole body of work around housing that we hadn't really initiated yet. And it all started with this action step number 2 within our EAP that said we needed to conduct a needs assessment to determine what housing is needed throughout York County, which of course is a really simple statement for a bunch of complex issues and analysis. And so in trying to address that goal within our economic action plan, we brought together a cross-section of housing partners in York County. And perhaps it's not novel in other areas, but to bring together a table of housing partners that represented emergency shelter and homelessness, affordable housing development, but then also market rate development and single family home development, our municipalities, our planners, our municipal engineers, our local officials, all to the same table, was really an intentional effort to get some cross-sector whole market collaboration across all of the housing market. Very intentionally not saying that we were going to create an attainable housing plan, but we were going to create a housing strategy that led to attainable housing. And we also wanted to avoid duplication. Obviously, there's lots of work underway in any community related to housing. I would argue that it tends to be pretty siloed around different segments within the housing market. So a lot of great work happening around homelessness or about affordable housing development, but not a lot of whole market analysis and really pulling back and looking at the systems and the structural deficiencies that are causing housing crisis. And so we initiated a 2-phase process for creating our countywide housing study. And the first was convening that steering committee and really trying to cut through a lot of the misunderstandings or longstanding kind of myths around housing by developing a really strong baseline of data that everybody could at least agree to. And that would level set and allow us to have some really factual conversations around housing. And we could use that data then to promote our findings and elevate the importance of this work beyond those stakeholders. And then phase 2 was, okay, given what we found in the data and these major issues, what are we actually going to do about it? And of course, so much in housing is mixed up in macro forces like the housing market and mortgage rates and things like that. So our focus throughout has really been what can we actually affect at a local level, at a countywide level, where we can see some tangible change in progress. And so some of this data will look really familiar to what was that Emily just showed. But we have the basic structural issue of a population that continues to grow, which isn't the case in all Pennsylvania counties, especially outside of the large metros. And our growth is outpacing our creation of new housing units. And so just at a very basic level, we are growing, but we aren't creating enough supply to keep up with that growth, which is leading to overcrowding and a lot of housing burden. When we look at home ownership by race and ethnicity, it's also revealing in terms of how different York Countyans experience renting and home ownership differently. 25% of all of our units in York County are owner occupied, which means we have a really strong home ownership base. But when you look at the rates by race, you can obviously see that Caucasian white households tend to own at higher rates. And so when we talk about disparities between homeowners and renters in York County, it's also a conversation about disparities by race and ethnicity. And just to hammer that point home, when we look at housing cost burden, which I know is a metric that many of you use to determine, how households are doing in respect to affording housing. We found that really it's only white households that on average are able to afford the average home in York County. We actually reran these figures recently, and now none of our none of our groups by race can actually afford the average home. So the average York Countian cannot afford the average home in York County, which obviously speaks to the issue here. We also found that nearly half of all renters and more than a quarter of all of our households in York County are cost burden, and that 20% of York County residents are considered severely cost burden, meaning they're paying more than 50% of their income on housing. Again, this varies by renter and by owner, and it also varies by race. We also learned some interesting things by looking at counties that are similar to us and nearby, like Lancaster County. And there's a lot of great data that we found, but one of them is that we just tend in York County to not produce as many multi-unit dwellings, particularly dwellings of 20 or more units, as Lancaster is able to do. And obviously, when we're having conversations about how to increase supply, those multi-family developments are really where we need to focus a lot of our attention, and we have significantly fewer than them as a portion of our overall units. So that stood out to us. We also were able to project in similar ways that Emily had, what is the need and the gap in how many units need to be produced. And what we found is there's a need for 4,580 affordable units of housing, and there's a need for 11,700 market rate units of housing. In York County, we do a good job of kind of producing housing in the middle of the market. We don't do a great job of producing other types of housing. And although it's not in the slide deck here, one of the issues is that we have a lot of people that remain in their starter home, or what a generation ago might have been a starter home, and they don't have housing options to expand as their family expands and move to a larger home. And so that creates a clogged pipeline for people who are seeking their first starter home. One of the things that one of the benefits of bringing together that table with market rate developers and affordable developers is that we could look at that entire housing pipeline. We also looked at what areas of the county are affordable and which ones are not. And this maps very well with, unfortunately, with the greatest number of people moving into York County being concentrated in the areas that are least affordable, in part because of that crowding and it being some of the most desirable places. And then trying to look ahead to solutions, we wanted to see, okay, well, if we want to expand our supply of housing, how much vacant residential parcels are in York County? And we found that we have 3,643 vacant residentially zoned parcels, but only 11 are greater than or equal to the 10 acres and located within one of our growth areas. And so the idea that we can just kind of as is go out and build enough residential to keep up with supply kind of was blown out of the water by some of this data. So some of the key takeaways that we had from that first phase were that we need a whole market approach and we need intermarket coordination. These problems can't be solved. Problems of affordable and attainable housing cannot be solved by affordable and attaining housing advocates and developers alone. We need to catalyze development of all types of housing across the entire pipeline. We need to focus on multifamily projects because we need that density and we need the scale of development to meet the need. We, of course, like every community, need to streamline the housing development process and reform zoning. And we logically identified our 36 boroughs across York County as the ideal place for much of this new residential development or redevelopment, in part because these communities had significant populations in the past that have declined over the late 20th century and 21st century and have the services and the space and now just need the incentives to redevelop. And so coming out of that first phase, we then gathered our insights and our feedback from our committee and other stakeholders and started to flesh out what are the tangible actions that we could take that aren't currently happening in the community to address what the data is telling us. And then we took those ideas out to all of our partners, the coalitions and collaboratives that are working in this space, our municipal administrators across the county, our corporate CEOs, our board of directors, the Rotary clubs. And it was really a process in which we narrowed down to focus on ideas within housing that seemed credible and had some consensus, and we felt people could really get behind. And so we published what we call the York County Housing Action Agenda, which is only 6 items filtered down from probably 200 different ideas. And the goal here was to create a simple list of priority actions on things that we can influence at a county level, to not make this about affordable housing and not make it about market housing, but make it about the entire housing market in general. To allow our housing stakeholders across the spectrum to speak with one voice around some of their priorities, and be able to turn to state agencies, our county government, our elected officials, and our private funders and say, these are priorities for all of us that you can invest in. And then to have our stakeholders use this to leverage their own projects and programs. And so I'm just going to walk you through these 6 items and give you an update on some of the tactics behind them and where we're at. And spoiler alert, some have gone really well and some have not gone well. So on the one end of the spectrum was the need to right away do something tangible to address homelessness and emergency shelter, because if we can't get a handle on that, then the rest of our attainable housing strategy really doesn't matter. So we have partners in emergency housing that identified the need for a permanent day shelter in the city of York, right at the heart of our community. And we were able, through the city of York, to invest rescue plan funding in developing that space and then funding the first 3 years of operation. So it's not a permanent solution. There'll be ongoing fundraising to keep that going. But earlier this year, a lot of our partners were able to cut the ribbon and begin welcoming people to patronize the day shelter and connect them to other community services. We also, through action number 2, recognize that that's certainly not enough. There has to be a continuum of care between people who are seeking emergency shelter and some of our affordable housing providers and others in the community, from public health and from social services. And so there is a multi-organization effort to really build out a continuum of care in a deliberate way so that people don't fall through the housing pipeline. We're aware of where they sought help, where they were helped, what kind of resources they need, in the hopes of seeing people move more quickly, more efficiently through all these organizations. There is no public funding that we're aware of to support that. And so we've been doing a lot of case making to our philanthropic partners. And in fact, we'll be launching a capital campaign around that work later this year. Action 3 actually speaks to something we heard across the housing spectrum, which is there's just not a strong enough workforce right now around residential trades and home rehabilitation. And so even if our housing authority wanted to improve its housing stock, or our private landlords wanted to make improvements to their properties, or we wanted to help aging adults remain in their homes by making home improvements, people are facing multi-month waits and the costs are escalating for that kind of work. And so working through the York County Planning Commission, they committed over $1 million for our organization to launch a home rehabilitation workforce development program. We launched that earlier this year in partnership with the York Builders Association. And we're actually now graduating our first class of folks who have gotten free training, over 50 hours of in-person instruction, have their initial OSHA and HBI and first aid and CPR certifications, and now can either get a job with a residential contractor, or if they're interested, can start their own business. And if they are, we have startup funding through our CDFI to get them started in the home rehabilitation trades. Obviously, there's a lot of work that has to happen there to get to some kind of scalable benefit to the workforce, but it's a start. One of our tales that did not work out as planned is action number 4. It won't surprise you at all that a big part of our work and much of what we heard from partners is that there needs to be more municipal outreach and coordination around housing. There needs to be more resources put to helping our suburban and rural townships and small boroughs figure out how to do zoning reform and create model ordinances that actually help provide housing, and to arm them with education and talking points to overcome the NIMBYism that often shuts down new housing proposals in communities. And so we had applied for a pro-housing grant from HUD, and we did not get it. We failed. But not deterred, we reached out and actually retooled how we were thinking of this so that it's not just about housing, it's about other critical needs in our community like transportation equity and expanding childcare access. And so we pivoted to something we're calling the Local Government Development Playbook. A core of planners are volunteering their time with some paid consulting assistance, and some of our key stakeholders on the municipal level are creating a playbook around transportation, childcare, and housing that'll include some of those model ordinances, some of the educational materials, the talking points, and a whole lot of hands-on coordination around expanding access around all 3 topics. So we're hopeful that by matching housing up with other critical needs in the community, we can address more than one need at once. Action number 5, and don't worry, there's only one more after this, is convening private developers. We found out very quickly, and this may have been a truth you've all known for some time, that there is very, very little coordination in the private sector where developers either see each other as sort of competitors or they just don't coordinate at all because they're way too busy. And so bringing together our housing developers that do affordable housing but also do market rate housing around the same table was really interesting during our study phase and has become really important during our implementation phase. In part, it gives an outlet for our housing developers to kind of say, here's the obstacles that we're facing, here's the resources that we could use, but it also provides us a platform to take the opportunity to get other goals in front of this group and talk about how they can help create attainable housing, even if it ends up being outside of the formal affordable housing programs. And so that group has started last year and has been meeting regularly ever since. And then our final one was just recognizing that our major employers have a big stake in attainable housing for the workforce. They were at our table from the beginning and saw the need and stepped forward with ideas about pilot programs and models in other communities. And so folks like WellSpan Health, which has 20,000 employees across South Central Pennsylvania, have a lot of ideas in the works, and we're coordinating with them. One of the interesting ones is actually down in Southern York County, where there's a motel that's seen better days that's located in very, very close proximity to Wolfgang Confectioners, which is one of our major employers. And Wolfgang has expressed an interest in purchasing this motel and investing significantly in it and improving it. So their workforce has the opportunity to have stable housing while they're in that really important transition phase from getting employed and then actually getting your first several paychecks so you can build up enough to make a down payment and be in a position to be successful as you get housing in the future. And so we hope to be able to support that and build on that and work with a lot of our major employers. And so in conclusion, we're an economic development organization that sees how important housing is to many of our other goals. And I would encourage you as you're working in your communities to think about not only what's a priority, but what can you really affect at a county level or a municipal level so that your stakeholders can see that tangible change sooner than later. Thanks.
Thanks, Silas. I think it's really great, and I really appreciate the action items you shared because it's so nice to see, we're all planners and we come from this planning background, but sometimes we forget that next step. So unfortunately, that's not always, and we can't succeed in everything, unfortunately. So we will try to take that as a win because in the future you might be able to adjust and reapply in the future. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ed to talk about more of a rural perspective in State College. Ed, just as a note, your slides are in presentation mode. I don't know if that matters to you.
All right, thanks, Leah.
Sure.
There we go. All right, well, first of all, I just want to thank APA and also MAP for having us today. And Silas and Emily, thanks a lot. And hopefully I'm going to build on what you guys have talked about as far as some specific tools. So I'm going to focus on one of the pieces that both Emily and Silas brought up as far as regulatory reform, and kind of use State College as a case study to talk about work that we are doing here, to try to set the table differently, to try to encourage more housing supply in the borough that hopefully then will have a more macro level effect on housing prices. So just to provide a little context, State College Borough is roughly 4.5 square miles, about 42,000 population, but we are the home to about 30,000 students at Penn State University. So we're the host community. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is affected by a really strong student housing market. So we have worked for years to try to create more opportunities for housing that is for longer term residents, because we have such a really strong student housing market. And so we have a community land trust that was started about 26 years ago. So we're an early adopter with that model. And if anybody ever has questions or wants to talk about the experience of community land trusts, we love it as a model. It's led to over 50 single family homes, about 11 affordable rentals in the borough that are now permanently affordable because the land is owned by the land trust, and improvement is sold to income qualified buyers or renters. We also have a mandatory inclusionary housing zoning ordinance. So in State College, if you're going to build more than 6 or more units of multifamily development, you do have to have 10% set aside. And we have various income banding in terms of residents, in terms of what AMI they need to be able to live therein, but or to qualify. I'll tell you, just pro tip: don't over engineer your income banding. If you do a mandatory inclusionary housing ordinance, it's sheer hell to implement. So and it does lead to people actually not being able to get in certain units. So we've had about, at this point, I think we're almost at 100 units that have been created, both built in the developments that were triggered by the IH ordinance, or for fee in lieu that's been paid into a fund. And so if you have any questions about IH, I'm always happy to answer those, because we have about 10, 12 years of experience now with administering that ordinance. But what I'd like to focus on from that is the actual changing of some of the zoning. So the Borough of State College's zoning ordinance is from 1959. So yeah, it's 66 years old, and it's ancient as far as some of the things that it regulates. In our code, we mentioned things like lard rendering and or horseshoeing and blacksmithing, in terms of we don't allow those in downtown. So it just gives you a little sense of just how antiquated the ordinance is. But I just always like to level set as far as what we're talking about when we are looking at zoning reform. It's the use of the land, it's the size, the height, the location of the structures on the lot, open space requirements, how much coverage, and of course the density and the intensity of the use, how much square footage, how many residential units, how much parking, etc. This is our zoning map, which
Ed,
looks
I'm so sorry to interrupt you
Yeah.
as you're presenting. I just wanted to let you know, I know Leah mentioned it, but it looks like we're still in presenter mode, and it's not the end of the world if we can't get it fixed, because we can still see things, but it's just taking a, oh, there we go.
all right. Is that better?
Oh, actually, that's just your desktop. Is there any way that you could switch the monitor to
Let's see here. Is it just lagging? Is that the issue?
No, it's that we're seeing the presenter mode, and sometimes this happens when there's two
Yeah, unfortunately, I
monitors.
have to have 2 monitors because unfortunately my camera is on the laptop.
Okay, that's okay. I'm just wanted to let you know.
Is that better?
Oh yes, awesome.
All right. See, I learned a new thing. We've only been doing this for 5 years now, right? All right, thanks, guys. All right, so just a couple fundamentals on State College as far as the zoning revision. The only reason I'm talking about this is I just want to point out that it's taken us 10 years to get to the point where we're finally at as a draft that's being reviewed and revised by our planning commission and council. So just as a point of keeping in mind when you're doing this kind of work, especially I think in rural and suburban communities, it takes an awful long amount of time to get to the point where elected officials are willing to move forward with an ordinance. So we really started this effort in 2016, and we're now at 2025, and we're not quite at adoption yet. So, and yes, there's COVID in between that, but at the end of the day, it just is something to keep in mind is that the resources and the time are really critical. So what we're trying to do in State College is increase market rate units, increase affordable units, and increase units both for home ownership and for renters. Focus on our downtown and in terms of trying to keep it a thriving downtown, and also better calibrate our parking. Just as many communities in Pennsylvania, we have an antiquated parking ordinance that we really felt as a community we were probably overparked. So trying to reduce the amount of parking has been a priority in the ordinance. When doing this kind of work, I think it's important to keep in mind that you're wanting to modernize the ordinance. We really wanted to clean up ambiguities when you've got an ordinance that's based in 1959. You have a lot of unintended consequences that have happened with the amendments over the years. And again, trying to maintain diversity in a really heavily influenced student housing market. When we're looking at trying to revise code, the first thing that we are really asking is this legal? So when you're working with municipalities to try to revise our zoning code to increase more housing opportunities, recognize that you may be pushing the envelope on some things that are not in the end legal or may not be legal. So what we're approaching it is, do we have a reasonable understanding or expectation that we're going to be successful in court? Because we know we're going to be doing some things that haven't been tried or are likely to run into opposition, which I'm sure many of you work in communities where there's a fairly outspoken or there's opposition to increasing additional housing opportunities or density. Secondly, can we operationalize the language? Can it be enforced? Is this something that we can actually get to change on the ground? And then finally, really focusing on an expectation that, as Silas mentioned, if we're going to be changing the zoning, we want to make sure the private sector shows up to actually build it. So really focusing on not creating language that is going to create a barrier and obstruction to actually getting new housing units created. So just a little brief timeline as far as when we got the initial draft ordinance. We're trying to get this adopted by March of 26. So in the end, it will have been 10 years since the project started, assuming we can stay to that timeline. And for those of you who like night meetings, we've had, this has been our summer as far as going through that. I just put this up as a point to sort of point out when you're trying to make wholesale revisions to a large ordinance to try to create more housing, it's, trying to eat the whole elephant is really complicated. I can tell you, trying to get our elected and advisory bodies to actually walk through to focus on specific content has been really challenging. So in State College, we've focused on trying to get additional floors of housing that in some of our multifamily units that are not going to be rented to students. So this is something where, again, it's a little bit unique to a college town, but we've had to really focus on trying to use deed restrictions to limit student occupancy to try to create that space in the market. We've also tried to incentivize green building design, in this case, LEED certification. And also, we've had a real hard time. We have a mismatch in our market about 1 and 2 bedroom units versus 3 and up. So we're actually using zoning to try to create or force the market to build 1 and 2 family units, because we know there's a market in longer term residence, but obviously if you're building student housing, you're essentially building off campus dorms. So the market tends to want to build 4 and 5 bedroom units. We have if you're familiar with State College, we have a fairly an older part of the borough that is relatively it's basically carved up duplexes into multifamily student housing. And so we've looked at it as an area to try to incentivize sort of moderate 6-story height development. And again, I just put this on is to show that we're trying to set a recipe book of a lot of different incentives to try to get an outcome that's both not student housing as well as energy efficient and some commercial space. And also we've reduced our parking minimums in about roughly half. I still don't know if that's enough, but we've also substantially increased things like bike parking requirements and really expanded how we tackle parking as far as ways to allow for fee in lieu or other alternative ways of getting parking minimums met, as opposed to just on site. But the really fun stuff when it comes to building more housing supplies in our residential districts. So we're focused on, we've reduced the minimum lot size. We actually have eliminated it in most of our residential districts. We have roughly about 40 to 50% of our residential lots right now are non-conforming, which means that they're not legal today under this current zoning ordinance. Many of them were platted before we had zoning, or they were platted in the 50s and 60s. So at this point, we've really tried to focus on messaging the need to make lots conforming. It's also been a way to try to get additional housing opportunities by focusing on making an existing property owner have an easier opportunity to redevelop their property or add to their property. At the same time, this is going to create increased supply, or the opportunities for supply. We've also prioritized lot width as a key standard, and we've dramatically reduced the minimum lot width. So it used to be 75 feet. Now it's probably going to be either 50 or 40, depending on what the final decision from council is. We've also standardized a lot of our yard setbacks, trying to make it easier for property owners. We had really outdated, complicated ways of doing lot standards. So we've actually tried to make those streamlined and easier for developers to then build. Also reduced a really complicated way of dealing with lot coverage, made that streamlined. And finally, we're re-legalizing unit types that used to be built in State College, and I'm sure in York and Philadelphia as well, as far as duplexes, 3 and 4 family units, as well as what we call cottage courtyards or courtyard multifamily uses. So these are 8 to 12 units around a central courtyard. Many communities had these types, but they've been illegal in State College since 1959. So just real quickly, just to walk through, so I know a lot of folks, in terms of you want to geek out in the presentation afterwards as far as some of the actual standards, but just to briefly show, this has been our focus on trying to be more graphical in the ordinance, and also try to change our use tables too. We, as I mentioned before, we had a really antiquated series of uses. So we've been trying to focus on permitting a lot more commercial uses in residential districts. So that's been a focus on our reform, as well as to get away from just single family, single use districts and move to a much more robust set of uses that are not just residential in some of those districts. I've also focused on specific standards. So in terms of creating more additional housing opportunities, we've tried to make sure that we don't have big garages up in front. We've sort of pushed those back, make sure we've got some form standards in the ordinance that really make sure that any new housing that gets constructed is going to fit in to the existing streetscape. And this just gives you kind of an example of one of the things that we're promoting with the cottage courtyard development. We think, especially in State College, but I think this is something that would be a great use in rural Pennsylvania as well, not just single family, duplex, triplexes, and quads, but I think this is an opportunity to get a number of different units that can be served by one driveway or can be served by an alley. But also focused on really expanding the definitions to make them a lot more user-friendly, but also just allowing more types of uses that are better fleshed out so that residents have a better understanding, and property owners and business owners, about what they can do. And this just shows you kind of how we've tackled some of the parking requirements, again, trying to pretty much reduce in half what we require. And some additional form standards for things like building orientation, requiring some fenestration and some off-wall offsets to try to make sure that buildings don't end up just being a sheer wall. So we've really focused on the missing middle component, which is really everything from our accessory dwelling units up to 3-story mixed use and live work. We've looked at not only adjusting minimum lot size, we've also created accessory dwelling units going up to 800 square feet, expanding our occupancy. We've actually been in the vagaries of a large public debate about whether we want 3 or 4 unrelated individuals in our homes. It seems to be moving to 4. Our current ordinance is 3, so that's going to be a way to get about 1,000 additional housing opportunities in the borough without really making any changes except changing a number in the code. And also focusing on deed restrictions on those triplexes and quads. So just wanted to point out for those who have not used the Missing Middle book, but this is Daniel Parallax's work, just can't recommend it enough. They've done all the standards that you need as far as being able to re-legalize a lot of these uses. That this book really goes through and identifies all the different metrics that you really need to have to make sure that the additional housing uses can get built in terms of the really building what we were building before World War II in a lot of cases. So what we did is we took Parallax's book and we modeled it in State College to try to show what it would take to try to transform some of our neighborhoods. And I think this is something that can be done in boroughs and smaller communities around Pennsylvania as far as taking existing neighborhoods, something that Silas already mentioned, really focusing in boroughs. This is what we've tried to do as far as show folks how much additional housing units you could get. So this is our existing lot zoning that we have today, which is a 10,000 square foot minimum lot for 1 family, 20,000 for 2 family. And then if we were to change that zoning, eliminate the minimum lot size and go to 50-foot width, we looked at what we had today, which was 9 rental units. We have about 31 owner occupied in this block that we are modeling. And so when we took the Missing Middle scenario, what we did is we set an assumption that 25% of the new development would be single family, 25 duplex, 25% tri, and 25% quad. And we sort of used those setbacks, et cetera, that were in the Parallax standards. And this gives you an idea of what you could build now as far as those assumptions. I will tell you a lesson learned. This freaks people out. So if you start showing people what it could be, some people love it, and some people immediately think that all of this is going to be built tomorrow. So just something to keep in mind is we're trying to temper these debates with when you look at other communities that have increased their zoning entitlement, like Minneapolis, for instance. Portland was seeing roughly 6% redevelopment over the last 10 years after they've relaxed some of their zoning regulations. So just keep in mind that when you see this, it's not going to all build out tomorrow, but it is something that could be aspirational over the coming decades. We also, just to wrap up on accessory dwelling units, as far as this has been a big part of trying to get this legalized. We've been looking at, again, 800 square feet, detached lot or detached parcel, detached structures, and making sure that ADU is no bigger or no higher than the principal structure, and also focusing on only having 1 parking space. I know we've had some folks who've asked for more, but we're trying to limit that so that it makes it easy to build. So we also tried to limit owner occupancy requirements, but we are requiring that we don't have a rental permit on both the ADU and the principal structure. So what we found is we did some modeling, and this is what would happen if you were to build out 1 street in College Heights in State College with the ADUs in the backyard. So again, not all this would build out immediately, and this did create a lot of backlash as far as we had some folks. We actually had one woman concerned people were going to be flying in shipping containers with helicopters and landing them in people's backyards. So those of you who've been through these public meetings know that some crazy things get discussed. But at the end of the day, we thought this modeling has been helpful to try to move the needle to get the reform passed. So I'll just leave with 2 lessons learned. And one is that for those of you who are working with elected officials to do this kind of zoning reform, ride the generational wave that's coming. I think we're seeing a lot of people who are entering into elected office and appointed positions that have different lived experiences, may not have been able to afford a house, may not be able to afford rent. And so we're seeing people who have had, who didn't purchase a house in the 80s or 90s, didn't have great interest rates, and are really starting to say what we want: more housing reform and more opportunities. So use that to your advantage. And I think that goes from rural, suburban, urban as well. And I think the second lesson is to make sure that you're providing resources to do this. We've spent over 2,000 staff hours on this at this point, and many municipalities don't have any planning staff at all, let alone a staff that can put that much time to this effort. So we had about a $250,000 budget for consultant help on top of that staff time as well. So I think that's a huge barrier for municipalities to do this kind of zoning reform. A lot of the modeling you saw is because we also have resources for GIS modeling. So just something to keep in mind is, and I think as you do advocacy at the state level, et cetera, advocating for more resources to municipalities to do this kind of work is really critical. So, and with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Leah.
Great, thanks, Ed. And thank you all to the presenters who really gave us a great picture of sort of the cross-section look at different typographies here in Pennsylvania. I did see that some of the questions in the Q&A were answered by our panelists during other panel times, so I appreciate that. Ed, one big question that some people are asking, can you please put the title and author of the Missing Middle book in the chat, as some people are interested in that. So we'll definitely get that up. So one question that I think I'd like to kick off the Q&A part with is, you know, we've talked about all these perspectives in different areas and how lessons learned were great for that area. But I'd like to ask how some of these perspectives and lessons can be approached at different typographies. So are there lessons learned, say, in the urban area that could be effective in the rural area, or vice versa, or adding that in? So I think that's really critical, because I don't want to say that only urban answers can be applied to urban areas, and only suburban things can be discussed in suburban areas. So to the panelists and whoever wants to jump on first, by all means, what type of solutions do you see that could be applied sort of across the typographies?
Jump in. So we got to do a really cool project working for Regional Housing Legal Services, evaluating justice zones that they implemented across the state of Pennsylvania, and that included a couple zip codes in Philly, also Scranton, Newcastle, which is north of Pittsburgh, and Norristown and Pottstown in suburban Philadelphia. And so that was a really cool way to see the housing stabilization efforts that were made specifically around legal advice also, and how they worked in cities versus suburbs versus rural areas. And what you see is that so for example, in eviction defense, which is and prevention, which is, I would argue, a really important part of the affordable housing picture, cities just have more resources in terms of pro bono lawyers, public interest law firms, and organizations like community legal services. And so folks in rural areas have to get a little bit more creative, and it's a more personalized approach, because you need to know the magistrate who's, you know, there at the district, who's in their office. And so it does create a lot more legwork, and there's a lot more education that goes into it. But having someone who's on the ground there who can explain why this is important and why it's good for the tenant and the landlord to both be represented in an eviction proceeding is really important. And so being able to tap some of the statewide resources to get some of that legal assistance. And then using statewide groups like the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project, which helps inform people how to bring down their utility bills, which also can be a really critical component of if you can afford to pay for housing, because utility bills can be a really expensive part of that. And so there's ways for some of the local groups that might not be legal groups, they might provide other types of community development services to get trained by the statewide groups on basics of utility law, so that then they can help people who are coming in for any other issue.
Thanks. Anyone else? Silas, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just something that stood out to me across Emily and Ed's presentation, and maybe mine, is just beyond the technical side of it, you know, how the story is told is important. And I really appreciated Emily's slide on affordability by occupation. It's not a way that we've broken down our data in York County. We have done it by race and age and geography, and probably at some real high level, like industry sectors, but not kind of like employment that people can really wrap their head around, and understanding if we want folks in our community who do these jobs, and we do, they cannot currently afford a home. And it just changes the nature of the conversation in a way that I think works regardless of what part of Pennsylvania or the world you're in. And then Ed's, I really like the visualization of that missing middle housing, and was thinking how useful that is just in very visually telling a story of impact. But then your caveat about, how different audiences will react to that differently, and you need to think about how you roll out that visualization is really important. So both of those I thought were just really good reminders that although it's not the focus of the work, the way that we talk about it is really, really important.
Yeah, I would say one thing, and I think this is especially for rural municipalities, and the data and having that information that you can tell a story with is, I know we struggle to be able to get it down to the fine grain of the local municipality. So having the resources at the county level, like you have in York, Silas, to be able to then tell that story across the board is, I get questioned all the time. Well, why are we doing this? Why are we adding housing supply? Do we really have a problem? Actually, it's the township's problem around us. We're fine. Why are we taking leadership on this? So being able to tell that story and have that data behind it. And Emily, I'm totally going to rip that off as far as how you presented that info. So thank you.
Please do.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. And when we talk a lot about advocacy and how we have these conversations with our communities, with our elected officials and with the public, telling that story is really important. And that's sort of a training tip that we've learned on the, talking to our elected officials down in DC about how to get more dollars. It's really how you tell that story. Who is this person that we're talking about? Because everyone has that person's picture in their mind, and you want to tell the right story and give them that right picture. So that's great. Thank you. So I'm going to jump into some of the Q&As. So these are more specific to individuals. So Silas, I'm going to start with you. And one of the questions that was asked talks about how is there incorporation of infrastructure costs, schools, capital, operational costs? How do you guys talk about that when you're talking about expanding your communities and adding housing? How do we sort of talk about that trickle down effect that can happen in communities?
Yeah, I don't think we have a great way of talking about it today. I know we try to, and a big part of that is by talking about our advocacy around housing as it aligns to the broader comprehensive plan, and really trying to focus our support in whatever form that comes in. A lot of times it's just advocacy because we don't have a lot of financial mechanisms around it. But to focus it on our growth areas where there is infrastructure, there's public transit, there is water, there's wastewater, and not contributing to the kind of development that we saw prior to the recession, where we were just simply sprawling out. And so we are like many communities that were probably represented in Emily's chart, where our new housing permits are still half of what they were in 2007 and 2008, which on one hand has given us breathing room to kind of do some soul searching about what kind of development we want to have, but on the other hand, still isn't producing the same amount of housing. So that's really captured in a lot of ways by our focus on more housing in our boroughs and areas that already have those services, and taking advantage of that fact and not putting more pressure on public utilities or on our transit system by building, away from employment centers and other services. But I don't know that we've perfected the way we talk about that or anywhere close.
Sure. Obviously, the infrastructure question is always important. How do we, and the transportation question of how do we get people from housing to jobs to childcare to medical services, all of those things come into play when we're making housing decisions, and giving people the opportunity to have a decision versus being told you will live here because this is your only option. I think it's really critical. So.
And Leah, the flip side of that, just because I don't want to make it sound like it's just a housing developer's
Sure.
responsibility is as we're incentivizing industrial development and employment, firms that need employment, not building them out in the middle of nowhere just because there's highway access or there's, cheap land, and really talking through the future workforce challenges that they're going to have if they build away from where people live, away from transit. That's the other side of the coin. So I think it's responsibility on both sides, really.
I totally agree. And I wish we spoke more about that in our economic development conversations
Mhm.
before they build the building. So
Exactly.
I think
Yeah.
that's a great perspective. Thank you. So I'm going to switch a little bit because there's a couple questions associated with historic structures and how there is some concern about as we increase density or increase housing options and opportunities, how does that affect the historical structures that exist in our current communities? And I think this is a question that could be answered by anyone, although I'm going to start with Ed because specifically there was a question about historic districts in State College. And how they could be affected by this increased density. And then Emily, I'd like to see if you have a more urban perspective on that as well.
Yeah, it's complicated, and it's a challenge because yes, we do have a local historic district that follows the Historic District Act. So council does have authority to regulate demolition and new construction in. We have two large historic districts in State College that are primarily residential. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as we adopt this ordinance as far as though in those historic districts whether council is going to permit demo or not. We have had a court case where council did deny a property owner from demolishing a historic Sears home. So I'll be really curious to see how they approach this. So I guess maybe check back in a year or two. But the flip side of it is, if you really look at where there could be opportunities for a lot of additional growth, it is in actually the more suburban and the plots that were really laid out really after the war, after World War II. So that's what I'm most curious. And those are not protected by historic preservation guidelines. They're 50s and up as far as age. So I'm just really curious to see if that's where we see more teardowns and building of quads, et cetera. And it's been a pretty open debate in the community about whether we want to be focusing new growth on the more suburban and newer parts of the borough or not. So stay tuned.
Sounds good. And Emily, if you want to do a little follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, this is a major reason why Allentown pursued a form-based code. So they wanted to protect their historic buildings, but you can actually introduce some density into older buildings. Thinking about the block I live on in Philly, which is all Victorian twins, and some of them are single family and some of them are 5 units, and they all look exactly the same from the outside. So there's ways to preserve character while still changing density. And then I think also it's important to address what the incentives are for preservation versus new construction. So thinking about if you can offer tax incentives that might be actually a little bit richer for preservation.
Yeah. Well, with that, I know we're coming up to the end, and I just want to say thank you to our presenters for sharing perspective. Their emails were put in the chat, and I know Jillian will be sharing the slides as well as everybody's contact information afterwards. But thank you to our presenters. I know that housing continues to be a hot topic throughout our area and throughout the nation, and we continue to see really great successes in communities as we forge together with this challenge, which is a new environmental change for us, is us working together to provide solutions as opposed to doing it so independently. So I thank you for your thoughts and for your ideas, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with this group and with the whole Mid-Atlantic planning collaboration.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Leah, Silas,
Bye-bye.
Ed, and Emily very much.
Thank you.
Attendees, keep your eyes on your inboxes. That's where we'll send out the recording link, the slides, and our speaker emails. But thank you everybody for joining. Appreciate it.